Hello. So today I want to just explain really quickly the difference between cohort and a case control study. This is more tailored towards medical school step 1 exam. So you can probably look at your first aid or something and then follow along. I just want to clarify and make this really simple because I think cohort and case control can be a little bit more difficult. They're so similar. So if you boil it down to the very, very basics, a cohort is looking at exposure and then tying it to the outcome. So we can also rephrase that as what are the risks of this exposure and causing the outcome. And then because we're studying medicine, right, we're looking at an exposure and then looking for the disease. So what are the risks of the exposure causing a disease? And then you hear me say this word risk all the time, right? And that's why it's called the risk ratio. What are the risks of an exposure? So that's why the cohort is related to a risk ratio. And in the case control study, we're first identifying the outcome. So we're looking at patients who have cancer, and then would tie it to an exposure. And then, so another way of understanding is, and the outcome is that the outcome has a chance or an odds of relating to an exposure. So that's why it's called an odds ratio. I know it's not as intuitive as a risk ratio because of the risk of developing something due to exposure, but it's just how we remember, right? Okay, so now that you understand this, you can look at the equations and they make a lot of sense, right? So when we're looking at risk, you're only looking at exposure. So that means and then when you're calculating a ratio, what we're looking for, we're always looking for the positive over negative. So we're always looking for a positive divided by a negative, or a positive here divided by negative. And the only difference between risk ratio versus odds is whether we use the columns or rows. So by remembering risk with exposure, it's a lot easier. So relative risk is a positive exposure over negative exposure. So if you look at the relative risk equation, you see A over A plus B, which is this horizontal line here, right? Over C divided by C plus D, which is the horizontal line here. And then, as I said before, it's always going to be a positive divided by negative. It's going to be the top divided by the bottom. And if you can remember, risk is due to exposure, the risk of exposure, then it's going to be the top divided by the bottom. And the idea, that's all you have to remember, honestly, because in the actual test, this is what they're going to show you. The only difference is it's possible they might show you A divided by B over C divided by D and confuse you with odds ratio, but you're smart, so just I think as long as you remember risk, it's understandable. But if you really understand why this is the case, the reason why it's A over A plus B is because A plus B will give you everyone who's exposed, right? So that means, and A is the one who are exposed and have the disease. So let's use cancer and as an outcome, and then cigarette smoking again. So A, right, will be positive for cancer and positive for cigarette smoking. And so these are the people who are positive to cigarette smoking over everyone who smokes cigarettes, right? Let's say 20% of the people. So let's say 20% of the people who smoke cigarettes had cancer, right? And then divided by, let's say, C, who are people who just naturally had lung cancer, whether without smoking, over everyone who didn't smoke, which is C plus D, right? Because that's everyone who didn't smoke. So let's say that's 5%, right? So, 5%. And then you would end up with a 4 times more likely to get cancer from smoking versus non-smoking. But the very, very basic idea is that you're looking at the risk of something, and the risk is related to exposure. You remember this, and everything will be a lot easier. And then naturally, as we said, the case control is due to outcome. So that means we're looking at the outcome. And then the odds ratio is positive outcome over negative outcome. So positive outcome, which is going to be this column right here, and then a negative outcome, which is going to be this column right here. So the positive outcome is going to be A over C. And then we remember everything is going to be positive or negative. So it's positive or negative divided by positive or negative, right? So it's A over C divided by B over D. So it's a positive outcome divided by the negative outcome, right? And then that would give you the odds ratio. So if you don't remember anything from this video, just remember when you're calculating the risk ratio, you're calculating the risk due to the exposure, and the odds ratio must be the other one around, right? It's because there's only two equations you technically have to know about. Thanks for watching. I know this is a very dumb looking video, but I hope it clarified something and made it easier to understand.